All right. We are in Galatians, and I went ahead and put the map up here just so we can remember what's taking place. Just to remind everybody, Antioch is about right here, Antioch of Syria, approximately there, where Paul's base of operations really was. Jerusalem is down here, and then the churches of Galatia would be up in the Galatian region, probably is the best way to think of it. Remember, not necessarily the official Roman lines, but the way that they generally thought of it. So, when he writes to the churches in Galatia, that is to whom he's writing, those churches that he went to on his first journey. Excuse me. And let's see, Antioch of Pisidia, the other Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. So, let's jump into kind of what we were talking about last week. Remember, we started in the text, and we noted that Paul seemed to be a little upset. Why do you think Paul might have been a little upset? You don't have to think too hard. He tells us. Yeah, Bruce.
Well, the Galatians were kind of following other teachers and some of the Jewish teachers and the Judaizing teachers.
All right.
So he was upset about that.
Yeah, very good. Dave, did you have something else you were going to?
Same thing, yeah.
Okay.
There were other teachers that come along and taught them another gospel.
All right. And so Dave used both. Absolutely right. Exactly right, Bruce, is what's going on. And Dave used kind of the wording that Paul uses, that they came in, and like I said, I like the way that the New American Standard renders this, that you are so quickly following after another gospel, which isn't even actually a gospel. It's not actually even good news. And just so that we all kind of remember what's happening here, let's say that you have Mr. Gentile out here who wants to come to Christ, and Paul tells him, what does he have to do that? Just go to Christ, right? He has an open path right there. The cross is available to all. But then you have some Jews over here that are like, well, hold on a second. So far, in all of Christian history, just about, Christianity has only been open to whom? To the Jews, who perform the works of the law of Moses, or works of the law. And so they would say, well, a Gentile should have to come through Judaism, because that's really what God promised in Genesis chapter 12. In you, all the families of the earth would be blessed, or in your seed. They saw that the seed equaled what? All right, that the seed was Israel. And if it just so happened that there was a way to come to Christ without going through Israel, the Jews say, Paul, you're saying that God lied to Abraham. That's the logical conclusion that they understood. And so Paul writes here in Galatians, and he's like, yeah, no, that's not true. And as was pointed out, Bruce and Dave both point out, they're buying it. They're believing it. They're actually going through with circumcision, of all things. There's a story, we didn't cover it, we didn't really talk about it. There's a story in the Old Testament that talks about how bad and painful circumcision is. Y'all remember the story with, go ahead, Kelly. Kelly knows all the circumcision stories. Go for it. Yeah.
And they said, well, yeah, we really like her. Let us marry her after they disrespected her. And the brothers were like, well, only if you get circumcised, because you have to be circumcised to be with our crowd. And they're like, well, if we do, so the guys met, they said, if we do that, then we'll get a lot of property, it'll work out well for us, let's go ahead and do it. So every guy in the town got circumcised, and while they were not able to move for a couple days, two brothers went in and killed them all. So,
Yep, Simeon and Levi. It was 3 days. 3 days later, they went into the city and killed all of the men. That's pretty brutal, right? You'd have to have a really good reason to buy into that. That's exactly what they're going in, walking into the cities and saying, this is what you need to do. And I guess maybe to a little bit of the credit of these people, they find out, well, if that's really what we need to do, we'll do it. But Paul writes and says, this is really messed up. Why? Why would they do it? Paul has already brought them into Christianity. Why would they subject themselves to entering into Christianity again, but doing so in such a brutal way? Or, I guess for the females, whatever the case, just going through the law of Moses. They wouldn't have gone through the circumcision, but why? All right, say it again for the folks in the back. All right, because of where Paul came from compared to the Judaizing teachers. And this really is the heart of the beginning of Galatians. Because where did the Judaizing teachers come from? They come from Jerusalem. So this is where your Judaizing teachers are. Where's Paul? All right, Paul's up here in Antioch. Why is Jerusalem important? Okay. All right, because it's the hub of Christianity. Very good. Kelly, were you putting your hand up? Or?
It's where the cross was. It's where Jesus died. It's where the church was for 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jonathan says the hub of Christianity. Absolutely true, because it is. It's where Christianity's founded. It's begun here. This is where the crucifixion took place. Acts chapter 2 happens right here. It's not until you get to Acts chapter 8 that people even go outside of Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria that we know about. So you're going a long time, and this is all that they have. This is the seat of Christianity. The apostles are tied to Jerusalem. And then you have this guy named Paul up here claiming to be an apostle, but what's wrong with that claim? He's not from Jerusalem. But at least he traveled with Jesus, right? Oh, he didn't? Well, what gives him the right to claim to be an apostle? Keep in mind, right now, Paul's only gone on one journey, and even on that one journey, we talked about this last week, who may have actually been the lead in that journey?
Barnabas.
Yeah, it might have been Barnabas. I mean, Paul and Barnabas go to a city, they're mistaken as gods, and they don't assume that Paul is Zeus, right? They assume Barnabas is the one who's Zeus. He may have been kind of the one leading things through that. Yeah, right now, we just have to remember, as early in Christianity as we are, Paul does not have the reputation that Paul's eventually, I think, going to have. And really, a lot of that is going to come from an event that has, as of yet, not taken place. And we'll talk more about that when we get into chapter 2 and start making some comparisons. So, the very first thing that I think we're supposed to notice is that Paul has his authority. It's almost like a Paul versus Jerusalem thing going on here. And that's the way that Paul is setting it up. As you read through this, by the way, and I think it's important to bring this up, when we talk about Jerusalem and the people that Paul, or the people who are sending folks out, are these the apostles, the Jewish leaders, or the Jewish Christian leaders? Are they the ones sending folks up here? Or sending folks into Antioch to have the Gentiles circumcised? No. Okay. It's very important that we understand that. Who in Acts chapter 15 stands up and says it is necessary for the Gentile to be circumcised according to the law of Moses? It was those of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed. Right? They're Christians. Right? They're not antagonistic. They're not enemies to the cross. They're not opposed to it. They're not persecuting it. These are Christian Jews, but they say Paul has got it all messed up. We need to go in where he's been and fix it. Fix his mistakes, fix his problems, and bring the Gentiles into Judaism like they're supposed to be. And they come from Jerusalem claiming the authority of Jerusalem. But I would submit they do not have the authority of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, or the Christian leaders in Jerusalem. Does that make sense? They come, Peter did not send them. James did not send them. John did not send them. None of the leaders actually sent them. All right? Everybody good there? I know I'm really hammering this home, but that could become really confusing later if you think that when I'm saying Jerusalem, I mean that leadership. So Paul is distancing himself from Jerusalem. Notice what he does here starting off in chapter 11. This is chapter 1, verse 11. He said, I would have you know, brothers, the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he, who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. Nor did I do what in verse 17? Nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. Instead, I went away into Arabia. And then I went back to Damascus. And then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. And I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. And then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet, because of false prophets secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace which was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. All right, so let's kind of break right there, because there is a key word that seems to flow through those various narratives. And what is that? I don't know, now we're back to playing Read Chris's Mind game here. Bruce? You can yell it out, if it's just a word. No, that's not the one I was looking for. It was a good guess, though. Jerusalem. Yeah, Jerusalem. All of his discussion here has to be his connection with the city of Jerusalem. And this is, I think, ultimately what he's trying to accomplish in the very beginning of Galatians. He's trying to say, yeah, I'm not a Jerusalem guy, and I don't want to be a Jerusalem guy. I don't want you to think in the terms of whether or not someone has authority because they came from Jerusalem, because does authority come from any man? Where does it come from? It comes from Christ. And he goes, that's exactly where my authority came from. Verse 11, the gospel that I preach, that was preached by me, it's not man's gospel. I'm not here passing on to you what I also received, which he probably did some of that to some degree. We know Paul tells the Corinthians that very phrase. But the heart of what the gospel itself is something that came directly from Christ. He says, I did not receive it from any man. And when he says any man, think the apostles and people in Jerusalem. That's the disconnect that he's trying to create here. That the people, just by virtue of the fact that they come from Jerusalem, they have clout. They have authority. They mean something. And he's like, yeah, well, they mean nothing to me, is really the idea. Yeah, you need a mic? Yeah, it's coming. All right, go ahead, Dave.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why would Paul distance himself from Jerusalem as opposed to from the Pharisees that came from Jerusalem? I mean, if the apostles were on the same page as Paul, why would he distance himself from them?
That's a great question, and we're going to get into that a little bit in chapter 2. I think there's question on Paul's part right now as he's writing Galatians. Are they on the same page? I'm not sure that he thinks that they necessarily are. And that's an issue that won't be resolved until Acts chapter 15, when you have that conference. And then at that point, everybody's on the same page. They all make their proclamations. They write out the thing to send to the churches. And I think from that point on, there's a unison among Paul and the other apostles that was iffy and sketchy before that. So I tipped my hand a little bit to answer the question on what we're going to see when we get to chapter 2. But Paul doesn't have overly nice things to say about the apostles in Galatians. And I think that that's part of what's happening here. I stress it because I do believe that they're on the same page. I do not believe at all that Peter, James, John, or any of the other leaders sent people out. But I'm not sure that Paul has an awful lot of faith in Jerusalem at the moment. So, anyway, that was a conversation that was supposed to happen in chapter 2. I got a little bit ahead of myself. That will be further explained in chapter 2. So I know some of you are like, wait, are you trying to say that the apostles weren't one unified group of people who all believed the exact same thing and had nice kumbaya parties when they got together? And yeah, I think that's the case. I think that there was a question of Paul's authority among the apostles. And, you have this rogue guy who did not spend 3 years with them. And he's just all of a sudden out there doing this thing. They're not the ones who commissioned him, right? Who was the one who commissioned him? Well, who was the one who went and found him and brought him to Antioch? It wasn't the apostles. Who was it? It was Barnabas, right? Barnabas, he's the same one that when Paul went in Acts chapter 9, he's the only one that said, guys, maybe we should give this guy a break, right? Barnabas, whose name means the son of encouragement, maybe he's just acting like a Barnabas, because he is, and he is going out of his way to include and bring Paul in. But that may not be the popular thing that everybody's doing in Jerusalem, because as of yet, I think Paul's still an unknown entity. He hasn't been around the other apostles very much at all, and that's part of what he's saying right here. So he's distancing himself, I think, very specifically from Jerusalem, because it is Jerusalem that is the flag that people wave when they enter into the cities, and they say, hey, listen to us because we're from Jerusalem. And then Paul, I think, is going to say, I don't care where you're from, Jerusalem's meaningless to me. You can claim to be from Jerusalem. You might as well claim to be from Rome. For all I care, Jerusalem means nothing. Paul is saying, I have the exact same apostolic authority that any one of those guys have, and I have it without hardly ever having gone to Jerusalem at all. So that's why he's trying to separate himself from Jerusalem, is because in the minds of these people and others, Jerusalem carries a special significance. And Paul is trying to tear that down. And he's trying to say, the real significance should be the fact that I spent time with Christ. That should be it. And that's why it says, verse 12, I did not receive it from any man. I wasn't taught it, but I received it very specifically through a revelation of Christ. So why would he then start talking about his persecuting the Christians? Why does he go straight into that story? Yeah, Kelly. What?
I'm being a bad student right now. I'm raising my hand too much. Well, there was Pharisee Christians who were saying that you need to get circumcised. He's like, hey, I was a really good Pharisee.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying to get circumcised.
Yeah, I think, what Kelly is saying makes the most sense, at least to me, that as he's going to start his argumentation about who and what he is and what authority he carries, it's almost as if he's saying, let me tell you about my contact with Jerusalem. And when he was in Jerusalem, what did he do? He persecuted Christians. That's how he began. And he was this guy, although for him there was no cross. It was just the justification and ultimately salvation of some sort came from your relationship with God through the covenant, through the law. And that's why, at some point, he tells the Philippians, right? He talks about being a Pharisee of the Pharisees, from the tribe of Benjamin. As to the law, he says he was perfect. And how many of y'all have wondered what in the world that meant? How could someone claim to be perfect according to the law? Because you can't be perfect according to the law, right? Anybody ever wondered that in Galatians or in Philippians 3 when he says that? No? As to the law, found blameless? No one ever wondered about that? All right. Well, ponder that. How is it that he could claim to have been perfect as far as the law is concerned, blameless as far as the law is concerned, before he came to Christ? So ponder that, not right now though, because we're going to move on. Ponder that, sometime, I don't know, when you can't go to sleep tonight. Think about it too much. It'll get you to sleep, probably. Or it'll keep you up all night trying to figure it out. So he starts talking about how he was the Pharisee of all Pharisees, living under the law of Moses, his time in Jerusalem. He was on the other side until what happened? Not a trick question. What happened? Yeah. The Damascus, road to Damascus. Y'all, we remember that story that took place there. So, verse 15, when he had set me apart before I was born, called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. He went on the road. He had the light and everything that was with that. Went to Damascus. Remember, Ananias came to him. He was baptized. And where did he go? Did he just go straight back to Jerusalem from there? Did he go and say, well, tell me where Peter is. I need to know more about this Christianity thing. Let me go hang out with Peter so he can tell me. Or James. Yeah, he says, I didn't go to any man. I didn't come down to Jerusalem so that I could learn what this whole Christianity thing is. He says, I went away into Arabia. And then I returned again back to Damascus. In fact, how long until he comes to Jerusalem? All right, 3 years. So we have Acts 9, where you have the road to Damascus, right? We'll just say that is the case. Mike, do you remember what date we put on Paul's? I'm sorry, what? Do you remember the date that we put on Paul's conversion? Yeah, okay. So, in 3 years' time, after 3 years, when did he come back to Jerusalem? Oh, I'm sorry. He came back to Jerusalem. Where do we find that? Where's that recorded? What's that? Okay, yes. Where do we find it in Acts, though? No, but you're absolutely right. Huh?
I don't think it's there, is it?
Oh, it's there.
I mean, it's not stated specifically that I recall.
Yeah. Anybody have any guess? Let's see. What's that?
There's a strong hint when he hooked up with Barnabas there, and Barnabas covered him for what he was in the past.
Okay. All right.
And he convinced the guys that he was talking to and being introduced to that he wasn't changed man.
Okay. So, John, do you remember what chapter you find that in?
I'm bad on numbers. I'm thinking about 11. I'm thinking about 11.
Yeah. Did you get a date, Mike? Okay, so let's do 35. All right. So if we go with 35, we've got 3 years. So in 38, this is Acts 9. Acts chapter 9, verse 26. When he'd come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles, declared to them how on the road he'd seen the Lord, who spoke to him, and at Damascus he preached boldly in the name of Jesus. And so that is 3 years later. It's almost hard to picture a time span of 3 years between those two accounts in the same chapter, isn't it? Oh, Bruce?
Yeah, it makes me wonder if you go back in Paul's life just a little bit to where he was persecuting the Christians, if some of those that he wasn't dragging back to Jerusalem to be handed over to the Pharisees, if some of those Christians didn't start educating him on being a Christian.
Well, I think his point is very clearly nobody did. Not them, not anybody, that he had a direct connection with Jesus. Jesus is the one who informed him on what this whole Christianity thing is. And that's why he says, I didn't go to anyone, meaning Jerusalem or anyone else. He went out to Arabia. He kind of went and lived as a hermit to some degree. He ends up in Damascus again, and then you see that up in chapter 9:22, right? Confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus. So we have two different accounts in Acts 9 that it's just easy for us to be like, what, is this like a couple months apart? Now, this is a period of 3 years take place. So that's our first Paul sighting in Jerusalem, for those people who are keeping tabs, looking for Paul to show up there. So we come back to Galatians. He says, let's see, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and I remained with him for how long? All right. You have 14? Oh, 15. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's roughly 2 weeks. And that's the way I think of it too, is, basically he's there for 2 weeks. So Paul went up there for a Christian boot camp, right? It was a 14-day sun up to sun down, learn what Christianity is. Is that what was going on? No. He goes up there, and who's he run into? Does he have a big powwow with all the apostles? Who's he see? All right, he sees Peter. Out of all the apostles, Peter and James are the only ones mentioned. The rest of them, they were out of town. I don't know, business conference somewhere, something going on. They're not there. And so Paul's connection with Jerusalem, yeah, he has a connection with Peter, and he has a connection with James, but it's roughly 2 weeks. And remember, after 15 days, if you go back to Acts chapter 9, remember that's when he started getting into discussions with the Hellenistic Jews from the synagogue of the freedmen, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And they want to kill him now. And so he's like, all right, they sent him out. He made his way to where? Tarsus. Roughly around in there. Some of y'all have a map, I'm sure. You'll be like, no, it needs to be this way or that way. It's roughly around in there. He goes to Tarsus, and then, Julia pointed this out to me one time, when Paul leaves, it says, and then the church in Jerusalem had peace. Get that guy out of there, and now they're able to. So, that is the first time that Paul returns to Jerusalem since he was a person who persecuted the church. And so he was there. He saw Peter. He saw James, the Lord's brother. And that was it. He says, and I went in the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Syria up in here, Cilicia, went into these regions. And I was still unknown in person to the churches where? The churches in Judea. What's that referring to? That's the churches around Jerusalem, right? Judea being kind of this general area, although more inward, anyway. That general area right there, that's the churches in Judea. He's like, the people in Jerusalem, they don't even know me. That's how little I've spent in Jerusalem. That's how little I care about Jerusalem. I mean, that's kind of what he's trying to get across here. He says, y'all can claim Jerusalem as much as you want to. I don't care. Jerusalem is meaningless to me as a place, as an authority, because the only authority itself is Jesus. So we get in then to chapter 2, and then how many years? All right, after an interval of 14 years, and I think this is why I'm going to move this. I think I usually go with 34. We're going to make this 37. 14 years from what? What do you think? Kathy?
Well, I'm guessing Jerusalem because it says, after 14 years, I went again to Jerusalem.
Okay, so Kathy said 14 years after Jerusalem. You mean right here? Is that what you mean? Because he said that after 14 years? Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't see it real well, but I think that's.
Yep, that's good. I think he's dating back to his conversion. I really think is what's happening here. He says, 3 years after my conversion, I went to Jerusalem for the first time. And then 14 years after my conversion, I went to Jerusalem for a second time. So now we have him around 48 or so, 14 years after his conversion. And now we have the account of him going up to Jerusalem, and they were trying to have his, let's see here, his companion Titus circumcised, and he would not stand for that even for a moment. So you have this Judaizing teacher question coming up as he goes to Jerusalem. Where do we find that in Acts? Where do we find this trip to Jerusalem in Acts? All right, Acts 15. And I'm going to put a little question mark beside that one because I kind of set you up. I don't think it's 15, actually. Now, 15, Mike talked about this. It sounds a lot like that, but is Acts 15, let me try it again. Take two. All right. Is Acts 15 actually the next trip that he makes to Jerusalem? Yeah, if you go back to Acts chapter, I'm going to suggest Acts chapter 11, he goes up to Jerusalem, and as Dave just said, I'm going to put a bookmark here so I don't have to keep looking for Galatians. All right, so in Acts chapter 11, he goes up because there was a famine that was coming. This is Acts chapter 11, starting verse 27. In these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up, foretold by the Spirit there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. They did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Now, let me give some reasons why I think it's Acts chapter 11. The very first of it is this: if Paul is very clearly in Galatians trying to separate himself from Jerusalem, and he's doing so by saying, let me tell you about how minimalistic my connection with Jerusalem is he going to skip a trip that he made to Jerusalem? It doesn't seem to me as if that would make sense. I think he's trying to recount to them every trip that he makes to Jerusalem, which aren't very many trips. You know, up until Paul writes to the Galatians, he's been to Jerusalem apparently twice. And that's it. Now, when you study Acts chapter 15, and we did, Mike, I was really glad that Mike spent a good amount of time on that. The problem is that it's been a few weeks. We might have forgotten some of it. Let me ask this question. Why did they go to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15? Okay, to settle a circumcision issue, because men from Jerusalem came to Antioch in order to tell them that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised to be saved, right? And so Paul and Barnabas said, let's go to Jerusalem and let's find out where the source of this really is. So that's why they went down. When they get there, who is it that stands up and really begins the process of solving the issue? Peter. Peter stands up and says, guys, I don't know what the issue is, but here's what's happened, right? This is what God has done through me. And they say, Barnabas, you and Paul, why don't you all get up and you tell about what God has done among the Gentiles without reference to the law of Moses. And then who else gets up? James gets up and says, guys, it's clear. I mean, it is clear that this whole Judaizing teaching thing is messed up. It's wrong. And we need to make sure to put a stop to all of this. Let's let people know it's wrong. And we're going to do that by creating an edict that's going to be, sent to all the churches, telling them, hey, you don't have to become a Jew, but at the same time, don't do these things either. Right? Y'all remember that from Acts chapter 15? By the way, that was taken to these churches by Paul on his second journey, I think, is when it would have been, but they would have received that. So, let's look at the way that Paul describes this trip in Galatians chapter 2. First of all, why does he say they went to Jerusalem? Verse 2. Because there was a revelation that had been given. And because there was a revelation, that is, a prophet revealed something, they made a trip to Jerusalem. Does that sound more like Acts 15 or Acts 11? Remember, why did they go in Acts 11? Yeah, but why did they deliver the funds? Because a prophet named Agabus stood up and gave a revelation, right? He gave a revelation, and so they took up funds, and because of this revelation, they went up to Jerusalem. And then he says, now, I went up because of revelation, and then privately, just among the people of influence, and some of those people privately, I set down before them the gospel that I proclaimed to the Gentiles, just to make sure that things hadn't been done in vain. And even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, even though he's a Greek. Yet, because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom, they wanted to bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission. So, he sat down with some of the influential people. Who are the influential people? Apostles, elders, right? And maybe some of the leaders, or the case might be. And it seemed to be going okay, but then there were a few who chimed up. And, verse 6, from those who seemed to be influential. Notice that language. Is that solidarity language? No. This is annoyance language. Those people who seem to be influential, and quite frankly, I don't care what they were. I mean, that's what he says. They seem to be influential, but what they were makes no difference to me. I don't care if, it's like, I don't care if they were angels. It doesn't matter. God doesn't show partiality. They may have a name, a title attached to them or some sort, but that doesn't give them any credence above God. Anyway, what does he say about those who seemed influential in the end of verse 6? How'd they help? They didn't. He walked up there into Jerusalem. They had their thing. And when they left, those apostles, elders, leaders, hadn't done anything to help the cause. Does that sound like Acts 15? You should be given a big fat no right now, because in Acts 15, who stood up and started it? It was Peter. Who stood up and helped? It was James, who was in complete solidarity the entire time. All of the leaders, right? This is totally different vibe going on here from Acts chapter 15. And he says, here's what happened when I said, you know what? Let's just agree to go our separate ways. Peter, you take care of the circumcised, I'll deal with the uncircumcised. And said, we'll just go that way. And they're like, hey, you know what? That sounds good. We'll take care of what we need to. You can deal with that. And we trust you to deal with that. And they're like, just don't forget about the poor. And you can almost see Paul like, what? Of course I wasn't going to forget about the poor. Why? It could have even gone without saying. That's the very thing that I always do. I mean, I get no vibe in Galatians chapter 2 about Paul and his relationship with those leaders in Jerusalem other than annoyance, because they did not stand up in that moment and do what needed to be done. They will. So we need to end here, but I want to make sure that you know this. They will. This is not the end of the story, just like so many other things. This is only one chapter in a story that's going to have a whole lot better conclusion. But we need to know where we are right now. It's not necessarily a great relationship between Paul and those other so-called leaders or influential people. All right, we're out of time. Thanks a lot, guys. We got kids sticking their heads in, so that is all we've got. We'll get into this. Hold your comments, thoughts, questions, and everything for next week, and we will continue this discussion. All right.